Thank you, Millie. And yes, it was wonderful to see the latest version of The Watchman come out earlier this week. And if you are not on the contact list for The Watchman, I'd highly encourage you to do so. Lots of relevant, very important information regarding upcoming events, but also critical issues that we need to be aware of. And Millie does an excellent job keeping us informed about those things. Now, and good to see those of you who are joining us online. Now, this evening and next week, we'll spend our time on the book Francis Schaeffer, a retrospective on his life and legacy. Many of you probably already have the book, but we'll not try to cover the whole book. That would take a long time. We'll focus almost exclusively just on his social and cultural, what he calls cultural discipleship. And I think you'll find it to be extremely relevant, just as the book that we just finished last week on C.S. Lewis on politics, government, and the good society. So any comments or questions? Without further ado, we'll go on into the PowerPoint presentation here. Now, those of you who join us online, since it's sometimes very easy to overlook any comments or questions that come in via chat, please don't hesitate to just unmute and ask a question or make a relevant comment. But I will, as I always try to do, periodically check the chat comments and questions that come in. Slideshow. All right, so I think probably most of you are somewhat familiar with the life and ministry of Francis Schaeffer. Others may not be all that aware of him. He's not mentioned much anymore, even in evangelical churches, but as I'll emphasize in a few minutes here, I think he's one of the most important Christians of the 20th century. And again, you'd be well advised to spend some time reading about his life, the phenomenal ministry he had, and his contributions, many contributions to 20th century American Christianity, but in Europe as well. He lived most of his adult life in Europe, in Sweden, where he had a community called L'Abri. And over the years, thousands and thousands of people, mostly college age and people in their 20s, but sometimes people middle age and so on, would flock to L'Abri to sit under his teaching. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. So as I said, yes, L'Abri was located in Switzerland. And yes, in fact, today there are 10 L'Abris scattered around the world. There are 2 here in America. And I wrote about those in the appendix of the book there. And by the way, Eric Smith helped with this book, and also Dan Siegel, who oftentimes joins us in this class. Dan wrote one of the articles in the appendix on Francis Schaeffer's son, the infamous Frankie Schaeffer, virtual prodigal son, you might say. But anyway, important to know. Well, now the book covers these topics, but we'll only focus tonight and next week on just a few select topics, issues. We'll do a preface and introduction. We'll skip over his early life and ministry, his ministry at L'Abri, his philosophy about apologetics and Christian worldview and so on. We'll talk about a book that he wrote. Probably his best known book was called How Should We Then Live? And that is, how do you apply your Christian faith to the whole realm of life issues? Everything from the arts and obviously the great moral, ethical issues of the day to politics. And we'll talk about his views on Christian social and political activism. And so I think just those few topics will fill up our time tonight and next week as well. All right, so let's begin with a preface here. And my introduction to Christian apologetics came in the late 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, apologetics has never been emphasized in most churches. And that's very sad and frankly inexcusable. And that's the case today, of course. Apologetics is at most just kind of a peripheral sideline issue. So many people in our churches today consider Christian apologetics to be just kind of again, a sideline interest of people who have nothing better to do in life than think. But you can imagine what the situation would have been like 50 years ago or whatever. And so there were very few books back in those days that were very well thought out, very well presented and engaging when it came to Christian apologetics. But one that had a great influence on, I guess, hundreds of thousands, if not more, young people back in the 60s and early 70s was Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And you see the date there, it was published in 1972. And most everybody I knew back in the 70s who was interested in philosophy and apologetics had read Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Have any of you read it? Have you? Again, it's pretty old by now, and there's been just a flood of great apologetics literature since then, so it doesn't get much attention anymore. But that's where a lot of Christians began their serious study of Christian apologetics. Now, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, well, that also wasn't that popular in the 50s and most of the 60s, but by the 1970s, C.S. Lewis had become a real icon among some evangelical Christians and Christian thinkers. And so I'm sure you see the date there when it was finally published, even though it was based on a series of lectures he gave in England during World War II. But Mere Christianity actually wasn't published till 1954. But if there's one book that I would recommend that every Christian read on apologetics, it would be Mere Christianity. Now, I had a brother quite a bit older than I who was in seminary in the late 60s. And he sat under the teaching of Clark Pinnock at New Orleans Baptist Seminary. And so I remember reading Set Forth Your Case by Clark Pinnock, and that also really excited me about the whole realm of being capable of defending one's faith. So those are three books that certainly influenced me. Now, over the last 30 years or more, since the early 1990s, there has just been, like I said, a flood of just excellent apologetic works come out. And we desperately need it, given the state of our society and culture, as Millie was talking about and was praying about. So those three books that, like I said, influenced me. Now, Francis Schaeffer is oftentimes acknowledged as the father of Christian cultural apologetics. most knowledgeable evangelicals, if you were to ask them who was probably the dominant figure in Christian apologetics, classical apologetics, they would say C.S. Lewis, and rightly so. But when it comes to the application of our faith and the truth, making the case for the truth of the Christian faith and how it applies to every area of our lives, even those areas that are rarely, if ever, addressed in church, we call that cultural apologetics. And Francis Schaeffer was a real leading figure in that field. In fact, when he started out writing on those topics, he was absolutely one of very, very few that did so. I think that he's probably one of the two most significant and influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. And I would put him not on the same level as C.S. Lewis, but I'd say that probably next to C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer, in my mind, would rank as one of the most significant, influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. I also believe that if you were to compile a list of maybe the 20 most significant influential figures in all of American history, well, I would include Francis Schaeffer as well. Who would you include? Just real quick. Who would make your list of the 20 most significant influential figures? You don't have to give me 20 names. Just who comes to mind? Yeah, in American Christian history. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean, you see how it's phrased here, 20 most significant influential figures in American Christian history. It doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves were Christians. Most were on my list, but a couple or so, or two or three or four, were not even Christians, but they were very influential in American Christian history. So who would make your list, just real quickly?
Abraham Lincoln. And Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson, yeah, Jefferson. Now we know Jefferson was a deist, wasn't he, Janet? He wasn't a Christian, but you're absolutely right. With his emphasis on religious freedom and so on, Thomas Jefferson made significant contribution to American Christian history. Chuck mentioned who? Oh, Jonathan Edwards. You also mentioned, I think, Billy Graham. Yeah, okay. John mentioned Billy Graham. Who else?
Ben Franklin.
I don't think so. Yeah.
I mean, he was very adamant about it.
Yeah, I don't see him as contributing much. Now, by the way, you mentioned Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist like Thomas Jefferson, but at the Constitutional Convention, remember, in 1787, the convention was deadlocked from the very beginning. There were competing agendas and priorities and so on. And so several weeks into it, Benjamin Franklin, of all people, gets up and says, why is it that we have never once considered asking for divine, inspiration on this? Now, why that's so strange and out of character is because Benjamin Franklin was a deist. Now, deists don't believe in prayer. They believe in an eternal creator God, an omnipotent creator, eternal God, but this God is remote and uninvolved in human affairs. And so the very idea of a deist telling our quote founding fathers that we need to pray about these, we're not making any progress, is quite ironic. But see, what it does is expose deism as being a false religion. And any false religion is going to have inherent internal contradictions. Only the true faith has no internal contradictions. And so interesting that you brought up Franklin. Any other names real quickly?
Anybody from the Princeton School?
Okay, Hodge, Warfield, Machen, people like that from Princeton Theological Seminary. Yes. Yes,
Dale
yeah.
Ryan's boss, B.B. Warfield, you mentioned those.
right.
Those would be-
Yeah, so they really were in the forefront of evangelical scholarship, I'd say, in the 19th century and into the 20th century. Anybody else, real quick?
Someone mentioned D.L. Moody.
Oh, Moody. Yes, Moody, probably the most influential evangelist between the time of Charles Finney and Billy Graham. Now that's 100 years between Finney and Billy Graham, and the one who fills that gap is Dwight L. Moody. In fact, we're talking a lot about him on Sunday mornings in our class here in our History of Christianity in America. Well, here's my list, and I don't want to spend undue time on this, but and there's one or two here that you say, well, I could do better than that. I could replace so-and-so with somebody else. And again, not all these people were positive influences. Some were, quote, progressive liberal Christians. And some were not even Christians at all, like Thomas Jefferson, for instance. But most of them, I think, made very strong contributions to American Christian history. And again, for time's sake, I don't want to go through all of them. I'm sure all of you and all of those online have read everything that Edward Wigglesworth ever wrote. Is there anybody that's never read all of his? Well, Edward Wigglesworth, let me just make a comment and then we'll move on. Edward Wigglesworth was the one who was most influential in bringing liberal theology to Harvard. As you know, Harvard was actually founded as truly a Christian college, and but it wasn't long at all before it became very, very corrupted theologically and eventually in every other way. And Wigglesworth is to be credited, actually blamed for that. And he, there at Harvard, he quote educated just hundreds and hundreds of people who became prominent American scholars and pastors and so on. So anyway, a lot of these names are probably familiar to you.
R.E. Torrey, Fundamentals of the Faith, Fundamentals.
Yes, he was involved in compiling, drafting, and contributing to what we call the fundamentals, which is a word that we typically avoid these days. Back in the early 20th century, when people referred to fundamentalism, it didn't carry necessarily the connotation that it does today. They were basically just describing themselves as conservative, Bible-centered Christians, or we might even call them evangelical Christians. All right.
I just wanted to make a quick comment because
okay.
I get the privilege of teaching American literature. And so we always read documents from the founding fathers.
Mhm.
And about a week or two ago, I went over Patrick Henry's famous speech, where it ends in "Give me liberty or give me death."
Mhm.
And when you read these speeches and you really, the faith that these men had of God, of the Bible, was amazing. Because even in that speech, he's like trying to convince the people, we're at war anyway. War's coming, so we might as well fight because there's no backing down. And he brings up how we're going to win because we have God, the God of heaven, on our side. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not quoting it exact, but it's just so powerful to reread their speeches and to see how deep their faith was. They were willing to stake their lives on it, that the fact that God was creating this nation and God was with them.
Yes, yeah, well put, Janet. Now, we always emphasize that America was probably the most biblically Christian influenced nation in world history. Now, we don't call it a Christian nation. It was not in the truest sense, but it was very much influenced by the Christian faith and the level of biblical literacy back then. In fact, well into the 20th century, the level of biblical literacy was so much higher than it is today, of course. But today, that's a very, very low standard, isn't it? And yes. Oh, yeah, Rauschenbusch, he was probably the dominant force in what we call the social gospel in the late 1800s. And he was pretty liberal theologically. But again, the social gospel becomes a very, very significant influence in American Christianity, especially in mainline Protestantism and liberal Catholicism, for instance. So yeah, that's Walter Rauschenbusch. I see here a couple of chat comments. Andrew says, would you count Thomas Paine for better or for worse? Thomas Paine was one of the absolute most hostile people toward Christianity back in the late 1800s, around the time of the American Revolution. And no, Thomas Paine, like Ethan Allen and a few other names I could mention, they were explicitly not just non-Christian, but actually quite anti-Christian. John Davis mentions John Wesley, and you see Wesley makes my list here. And several of these on the list, of course, are actually not Americans, but they've had a great influence on American Christianity. So Wesley would be one of those, and obviously C.S. Lewis would be one, and so on. Yeah, well, I wish we had more time to spend on this, but we probably better move on. I've actually got several more slides. All right, so here's Francis Schaeffer and his great contributions to Christian apologetics. Now here, we're talking about what we would call classical Christian apologetics, and that is, how do we make the case that the Christian faith is true? And in other words, what evidence and what reasoning, logic and reasoning, can we make the case for the Christian faith? That's classical apologetics. And it's just so extremely valuable and important, as I'm sure most of you know. So Schaeffer begins his writing career by writing these three books: The God Who Is There, in other words, the God who exists; Escape from Reason, talking about those who deny the reality of God, also deny reality in so many areas of life. I mean, think about this, transgender fad and all this kind of stuff. Oh my, by people who, many of whom are very proud of being so smart and intellectual, but it's just totally out of sync with reality, isn't it? Obviously. So the God who's there, escape from reason, and he is there and he is not silent. So there is a God who exists. And by the way, because he loves us so much, he has revealed in some degree of specificity his character and nature to us through the Bible. So three very valuable books for anybody that is interested in basic classical Christian apologetics. But then, of course, his major contributions are probably more in the field of Christian cultural apologetics. And he writes quite a lot. I'm just featuring 4 books up here. The Church at the End of the 20th Century. And by the way, even though all these books are 50 or so years old, all of them are well worth reading today. The Church at the End of the 20th Century, How Should We Then Live, which we'll focus on in a little more detail. A Christian Manifesto, kind of a counter to the Communist Manifesto, I guess you'd say. And then his last significant work was the Great Evangelical Disaster, in terms of how contemporary evangelical Christianity is has lost a lot of its credibility. It's become anti-intellectual. And Dan, what else would you say about some of these books? I mentioned before you came in that you contributed to the book and wrote a piece on Francis Schaeffer. But as far as these 4 books, anything you would
well, of course, How Should We Then Live was also it was written, Schaeffer a decade earlier had seen Sir Kenneth Clark Civilization series, BBC television series, where Sir Kenneth Clark goes to all these different countries. He gives a very secular, sort of like the European Union, you may be aware, sort of erased Christianity from European history. Kenneth Clark seemed to minimize the Christian contribution to human civilization, and especially European civilization. So Schaeffer saw this on the BBC television and said, if I ever get a chance to hit that, I want to hit that. And so his response, once he got $1 million in donations, was to do this film series where they go to 11 countries and basically do the Kenneth Clark thing, but point out that the humanistic worldview is inadequate, the Roman worldview is inadequate. Even the medieval church had issues that needed addressing. So he has a segment on the Reformation, things like that. If y'all go to the Labrie website, Labrie was an organization he founded, of course, Labrie.org. You can watch all of the film series for free at the Labrie website or elsewhere on YouTube. But
and the film series, technically, artistically, looks very, very, very dated. It looks like something that was produced, frankly, in ancient times, like the 1970s, for instance. But it still has so much merit, I think.
On that really quickly, Jeffrey and I take a slightly different view of that. I would argue that How Should We Live film series holds up with any contemporary, like public television documentary of its day. They spent $1 million and it does show. They did go to Israel and all these places. Nonetheless, he's gone. On the Great Evangelical Disaster, you'll notice on the cover the illustration of this perfectly nice church, and it's got its beautiful little lawn, and we're so cute and happy, but the whole world is this total disaster because we haven't spoken up. And years ago, here at the Areopagus, we got a forum with Mark Cooley of the IRD, the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and he has spent most of his career at that organization. He was a CIA analyst before that, but he spent most of his time in that organization. I'm almost done. Most of his time in that organization trying to rescue liberal mainline denominations like his own United Methodist Church and drag them back into Christian orthodoxy and believing the Bible. However, in the meantime, he noticed that a lot of evangelical churches and institutions were adrift and in danger of repeating the same mistakes of the 1920s. Right. And that's exactly what Schaeffer writes about in there. And he quotes names and places and people, and is pretty unsparing. And he just quotes them. He doesn't. This is what he said.
Yeah, if you read The Great Evangelical Disaster, you'd think that it was pretty much a commentary on right now, what's going on in evangelicalism today.
That's all in.
Yeah.
Divorce, abortion, homosexuality.
I mentioned his ministry at Labrie in Switzerland, and eventually they occupied several dwellings there. And I mentioned that over the years, just thousands and thousands of people, curiosity seekers, true spiritual seekers, those that wanted to correlate the Christian faith with their understanding of philosophy and intellectual life. Just a vast variety, frankly, of people came to Labrie over the years, and it was just such a innovative ministry. I wish that we had hundreds of ministries like that. It's desperately needed. Well, also Schaeffer.
My daughter was there last June.
Oh, she did. Which Labrie did your daughter visit?
The one in Switzerland.
The one in Switzerland. What was her reaction or response?
One of the people that she roomed with was vaping in the room.
Was what? Oh, vaping.
Really so I think there was
Yeah,
the
it's a good
people-
place to go and vape.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mention that.
Some people, I think, were there for a good reason. I think.
Mhm.
Not happy. But yeah, she had really enjoyed it.
It was generally a positive experience. Our daughter, as soon as she graduated from college, from UGA, she and some friends went around Europe and everything. And she also visited L'Abri for a week or more. And so it was, very influential in her life as well. Well, Francis Schaeffer is someone that is rare and sorely needed today. He is a prophetic voice for our time. He was a true cultural watchman. And he writes, for instance, in one of his works, through my work, there's a common unifying theme, which I would define as the lordship of Christ in the totality of life. Now, to us, I mean, that doesn't mean that much. But think of Christians, and you know plenty of people like this, whose Christian faith is so narrowly defined that all it is their, quote, personal relationship with God, and maybe their prayer life, maybe their family life and church life. But beyond that, their Christian faith really doesn't relate to how they think about the broader scope of life's issues. So that's the point he's making, the lordship of Christ in the totality of life. If Christ is indeed Lord, he must be Lord of all of life and spiritual matters, obviously, but just as much across the whole spectrum of life, including intellectual matters. Christians ought to be the best thinkers in society. Areas of culture. How do we assess, TV and the arts and movies and music and things like that? Law and government. I would want to emphasize, he says, throughout my work, the importance of evangelism, of course, the need to walk daily with the Lord, to study God's word, to live a life of prayer, and to show forth the love, compassion, and holiness of our Lord. I think most all evangelicals would agree with that. But we must emphasize equally and at the same time the need to live this out in every area of culture and society. And of course, we're coming up on another election, which is the best motivator I know of to pray for the second coming of Christ. But regardless of how difficult and exasperating it may be, we need to apply our Christian standards and values to this very important process, and pray that Christians take this seriously. And we'll talk a lot more about that later. All right, so here's the introduction that I would posit for the book, and I think you've seen this probably before because it's a great place to start. We are absolutely a nation in decline, and I go back to 40 or 50 years before I was born, back to 1963, and there was this human being named Bob Dylan back then. And he wrote and recorded a song that was very influential in the 60s called The Times They Are Changing. And he meant that as a positive theme, of course. America, needed to be changed dramatically. But 30 years later, he follows up on another album with a song called Everything is Broken. And I think those two songs really encapsulate the changes we saw in the late 20th century. And I think I mentioned this before. Now, that was 30 years ago when he wrote Everything is Broken. And what would be a fit song title today? I can't imagine. In fact, maybe that would be the song title. I can't imagine what this world and what our society and cultures become. What, Corley?
We can't use that kind of language.
Oh, yeah.
That'd be inappropriate.
Good. Yeah, that's right. Good point. So what we're seeing today, of course, is absolutely an unprecedented breakdown of law and order, civility, public decency, personal morality. It's really quite sickening. Greg Jesson, who came under the tutelage of Francis Schaeffer and later became kind of a contributor there to Labree's ministry, wrote all the literature, philosophy, theology, all the science, political thought, art, music, and culture that brought about the greatest accomplishments and freedoms in the history of the earth, including they really spawned what in many respects would be the greatest nation in all of human history, the United States. All of that is quickly melting away. The stability which we once took for granted, what was once unthinkable is now beyond dispute. So again, just think of all the moral insanity, which just in some cases 20, 30, 40 years ago would have been just unthinkable, has now been normalized. And celebrated. Yeah, not just tolerated, but actually promoted and celebrated, even by the current administration. We'd want to look at the social consequences of all this sin. And the social consequences, I think, are all derivative of 5 insidious agendas. And again, we've touched on this a few weeks ago as well. And it all starts with secularism, a godless worldview, shutting out God's revelation that we encounter in Scripture. And that's where it all begins. So you see Michelangelo's famous painting here of the creator, of the creation, but we've taken out the creator. It's just Adam. And apparently he's just the product of mindless, impersonal evolution, because there's no God in the picture. Sexualism, starting in kindergarten, early elementary school, beyond this sexual agenda is being pushed on young people in many, many schools in America. Socialism, and it's presented this way. The famous quote from Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto: from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And we've talked about that, and that sounds very moral, doesn't it? But of course, what does it take to enforce an equal distribution of wealth and so on? It takes an imperious state, doesn't it? It takes state control over every area of life. Christian socialism, on the other hand, was all, remember, voluntary. The kind of socialism we read about in the book of Acts, and frankly in the early church to some extent for the first generation or so. That was all voluntary, spirit-led, has nothing to do with secular socialism. So you look at that quote by Marx, and again, a lot of very gullible people will think that that's really quite moral. But look at this quote from Marx's foremost disciple, Vladimir Lenin, who told us that the goal of socialism is communism. Now, that doesn't sound so hopeful, does it? Because we know the unbelievable horrors and evil that have been perpetrated through the ideology of Marxist communism. So secularism, sexualism, socialism, oh dear, racialism. We have critical race theory, which is basically just an element of Marxist critical theory in general. We have DEI, of course, that has permeated so many institutions, education and business institutions and so on. It's this absolute obsession with race. And nothing could be more anti-biblical, anti-Christian than to assess and judge people and relate to people on the basis of their skin color, of their race. Now, the degree of racialism we see today, I think, would have made the Nazis very, very proud, because they were also racialists and racists. Now, there is a difference between racialism, which is just an obsession with race, where everything you process through a racial prism, and racism has more of a proactive component to it, doesn't it? Where you tend to discriminate against people on the basis of race. So they're not exactly the same thing. But I think the Nazis were racialists and racists. So was the Ku Klux Klan. And so if Nazism and the Ku Klux Klan were evil, then how can we possibly give a pass to the kind of racialism and racism that's just constantly being manifest today in American society? And then lastly, and I only thought of this a year or two ago when I was going back through the previous four contributing factors, and I thought, okay, now if you want to control people's lives, then it's best to just keep them totally preoccupied with, insignificant things, and frankly, keep them all drugged up. And so anesthetism, in other words, just people living in a culture that's constantly in chaos and tumult. Stimulus overload, getting iPhones for, 6-year-olds, so that whenever you're busy parenting, you just give that to them and that'll keep them busy. We also know the effects that it has on the brain, which are very negative. Mind-altering drugs, obviously. Addiction to TV. Dolly, for many, many years, in her work at an elementary school in the city of Marietta, she would visit oftentimes the homes of some of the students, especially students who were really floundering. And she almost invariably, I think, you would go into these homes and the TV was always on, blaring all the time. And so think about what that does to your mind. Pardon me? Yeah, they wouldn't even turn the TV down or turn it off while she was there trying to converse with them. And just think of obviously anything that's not mentally healthy can't be spiritually healthy. And then of course this addiction to social media and sports and so on. So many people just, basically they live for the next game, whether it's football or baseball or basketball or whatever. So that kind of leads us to Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, which we'll take up actually in a couple of weeks and go into it in some depth. But you see that Rod wrote this book in 2017. We brought him in for an Areopagus forum over at Perimeter Church. Gosh, I think we had like 250 people show up for that. One of the most valuable books, I think, of the last 20 or 30 years. And in his book, he addresses several critical issues, which we'll go into more depth on again when we take it up in a few weeks. But I decided, since his book was so controversial, a lot of Christians and others just didn't like it and were offended by it. And so I thought, okay, before we study a book like The Benedict Option, I need to write kind of a preface as to why this book is so important. And so there were 3 questions that I posed that I would hope would help people think through it as they read through this book. And that is American culture getting progressively better or worse? Now, for us, that's a no-brainer. But if you were to just go out into mainstream society and ask, I think you'd get shockingly diverse views on, is American culture getting better or worse? Here's a quote from R.C. Sproul. Really one of the most powerful and convicting things I've read in a long time. And Sproul writes, and this is back in the 1990s, I believe, or early 2000s. I doubt, he says, if there has been a period in all of Christian history when so many Christians are so ineffectual in shaping the culture in which they live, as is true right now in the United States. Now, you know, we could just meditate and ruminate on that for the rest of our time here. I mean, that's quite profound. And unfortunately, it's profoundly true. So what influence, you know, does Christianity have in the public square? It used to be considerable. Now it's pretty much all, you know, evaporated, hasn't it? Now, secondly, is there actually a culture war going on in America, or is this just a right-wing myth? Well, again, you're going to get some very diverse views on this. The idea of a culture war, I wrote in the book American Crisis, the idea of a culture war is not a popular topic. And anyone who raises the issue risks public ridicule and condemnation, even in churches, I might add. But in reality, there are two Americas whose values and goals are incompatible. From point of fact, the culture war is real, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we want to pretend that it's, you know, just a myth or not. Prior to the 1960s, the analogy of barbarians at the gates of American civilization served as an appropriate metaphor. The barbarians were still pretty much out on the fringes, except in, you know, places like Columbia University, the Ivy League, you know, areas like that, popular culture, that sort of thing. Now, though, for more than 50 years, cultural barbarians have been methodically besieging one citadel after another, ransacking our city and wreaking absolute havoc. America's culture war is not an illusion, and those who refuse to acknowledge it are either spiritually and morally blind. We have an awful lot of Christian church leaders who are morally and spiritually blind, or else they're egregiously apathetic or too timid to engage it. Now, turbulent times call for people of courage and conviction, and people who understand the issues at stake and who are willing to engage the fight. See, so many Christians and so many conservatives in general say, look, all these controversial issues, you know, let's just seek kind of a middle ground. Okay, we've had candidates, presidential candidates for the Republican Party the last year or so who have said, let's find a middle ground on abortion. Well, wait a minute, either you believe in the sanctity of human life or you don't. And honestly, there really is no middle ground there. Unless we want to say, okay, well, let's all agree that we can kill, you know, no more than 1 million every year. Okay, how's that for a compromise? Well, we know that's, you know, totally immoral to think in those terms. But is there a culture war? The issues at stake, Dennis Prager puts it this way. He says, America will be united only when one of these worldviews prevails over the other. And I wrote in the book that a lot of people in the secular left understand full well, although they're loath to admit it, but they understand full well, yes, there is a culture war going on, and they intend to win. And they intend to win by any means necessary, to quote Malcolm X. But so many conservatives and so many Christians, are afraid to acknowledge the reality of the culture war. And so when you've got a lot of people who are pacifists, basically refuse to fight, then it's pretty obvious who's going to prevail. Thirdly, is true Christianity countercultural? And I'm not talking about just, church going and that sort of thing, but true Christianity. And throughout Scripture, of course, we encounter many, many verses to that effect. 2 Corinthians 4:4, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers, so they cannot see the light of the gospel. It takes, frankly, a spiritual phenomenal miracle to awaken us to the state of our soul and to reality in general. Galatians 1:3-4, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself to rescue us from this present evil age. It's always been an evil age, but obviously some ages are far more blatantly evil than others. And that's what we've been exposed to the last, several, actually last 3 or 4 generations. James 1:27, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So basically the point there is that if we just accept the standards of this world, which is basically I'm here to make as much money as possible by any means necessary, to live at as high a standard as possible, to have as much fun as possible in this life. Well, those are worldly standards, aren't they? And those are the kind of things that will pollute our soul. 1 John 2:15, do not love the world. He's talking about the world system, of course, not the people in the world, but the world system. Do not love the world or the things of this world. And of course, one of the most convicting verses in the New Testament would be Romans 12:2, where the Apostle Paul writes, do not conform to the patterns, the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, these days also the ways of talking of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And in that sense, we can fulfill God's purpose for our lives. But the pressures to conform are certainly enormous. The true Church of Jesus Christ is a countercultural church. And I don't mean, that term counterculture became popular back in the 1960s with the hippie movement and all that sort of thing. Well, that was kind of an ersatz counterculture. It was, it really was not countercultural in many respects, certainly not authentically. But as Christians, we do need to consider that the ways of this world are anything but patterns of life that we want to adopt, because they all have a corrosive effect on the state of our souls. So the Church of Jesus Christ is a countercultural church, but it also should be a prophetic church as well. And again, we have wonderful people like Francis Schaeffer and many others that we could cite who have helped us think through those issues. Yes, Dan?
Might not have been original with Dr. King, but I think I associate him with the phrase that Christianity, the church rather, is supposed to be not a thermometer, but a thermostat.
Yes.
We're not supposed to just register what the temperature is. We're supposed to change the temperature.
Mhm.
It's supposed to have an effect that makes
Yeah.
the temperature a certain amount, not through force, of course, not through violence or anything, but through our benefit.
Yeah.
Which does include things like writing to Congressman, praying, and showing up at meetings.
Yeah, Martin Luther King, it was a very articulate statement. We're not called to be, just a thermometer of our culture, but rather a thermostat to control the temperature in our culture. Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. Now, what we're experiencing today in America is cultural homicide. I think it's death intentional death being forced upon us. Now, as Christians, we might say, well, no, what we're seeing today is cultural suicide, the intentional, killing off of everything good and decent in American culture and American tradition.
She gave a lot of statistics about all the unindicted homicides. It was mainly about homicides. It is.
Yes. There's two ways to think about this. The one would be, is what we're seeing cultural suicide, or is it homicide? It doesn't really matter because the end result is death, cultural death. Contemporary America is degenerating into a new dark age. Now, a lot of people think, oh, that's nonsense. Look how sophisticated we are technologically and all. Well, does anybody actually think that is the measure of a good society necessarily? I mean, we all benefit from it, and it can certainly, enrich our lives in some respects. But technological innovations, yeah, that's fine as far as it goes. But there are things that are far more important than that. Approximately what percent of Americans consistently hold traditional moral-based values, including most evangelical Christians? Well, I've been trying to track this for decades, and it seems to me that in American society, what we could say is that maybe about 30% of Americans consistently hold to traditional moral values and so on. And, it could be a few percentage points lower. I doubt that it's much higher than that, but I would say about 30%. Oh, well, yeah, Millie brings up surveys by the Barna Group that indicate that just a tiny percent of Americans and American Christians hold to a consistent biblical worldview. And of course, that depends on how we define a biblical worldview and all. And so what I was kind of basing this on is people's opinions on some of the great cultural issues of our day. And I'd say that, again, at most, it's about 30%. Now, you're quite right, though, when it comes to a consistent biblical worldview, depending on how that's defined, it would be far less. Yeah. So we were talking about evangelicals in particular. So what is one of those things anyway? What is an evangelical? And I'd say there's four defining factors. One is they seek to be Bible-based Christians. They believe in the divine inspiration of Scripture. They believe that the Bible is historically reliable. And they also believe that the Bible is doctrinally and morally authoritative. So that's a major component. Secondly, Christocentrism. In other words, our focus is on our Savior, Jesus Christ. It's not on church tradition and some of these other factors. So it's Christocentric. Conversionism, we understand that as human beings who seek to fulfill our purpose and calling in life, it calls for a true spiritual conversion. And one of my favorite courses that we've taught in the past has been writing your spiritual autobiography. I love that because everybody's story is so unique and frankly just incredibly inspiring, how they came to faith in Jesus Christ. So conversionism, and then of course evangelism. We're called to be witnesses for Christ. So I think those four factors really define what we call evangelical Christianity. So about how many Americans, what percent consistently hold to just traditional moral-based values? Well, again, I'd say, at most about 30%. It could be quite a bit less. approximately what percent of Americans consistently, and I would say proudly and all, support the liberal, progressive, socialist agenda? What would you say? Oh, I'd say at least 30, 35. Think of the way they vote and the way they think on these great moral issues of the day. And the radical left has a very strong base. Now, a lot of people, of course, are not honest if you were to ask them. In fact, we know how futile it is to ask somebody, are you a political conservative? Well, a lot of people, that doesn't really mean much to them. Or are you a political liberal? So like the Barna Group does, we would assign them that label based on their views on certain key issues. And that's the basis on which we proceed, not self-identification. Now, if you were to ask somebody, are you a Baptist? Well, either you are or aren't. I mean, that's pretty clear cut, right? But if you were to ask, are you a Christian? Well, again, people's understanding of the Christian faith is very, very broad and very, very murky in many respects. And are you an evangelical Christian? Well, most people wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about there, other than maybe some stereotypes that they import. Chuck, yes, comment.
Barna in this discussion, you have to be very careful with Barna. He used the sociological definition of Christianity, and therefore it's more or less based upon your cultural standing and your cultural Christianity, rather than any theological import. So the definition of evangelical that you gave on the slide, I would say, is probably more hopeful than realistic, because those are things that you have a presumed world view that is theologically conservative, and yet every liberal Christian would agree with every point of it. That's why you get liberals who will agree and assign, say, I believe in this catechism, but you look at their practice, it's clear that they don't believe the same thing.
Yeah, no, if they're in touch with reality at all, liberals are not going to say that they believe in the historical reliability of Scripture or the doctrinal and especially moral authority of Scripture.
But they'll subscribe to a definition that obviously we would subscribe to, and then they would have a different definition of the word.
Yeah,
Evangelical, many would agree with the primary purpose.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, yeah. Well, depend. Okay, that gets us into Calvinism and Arminianism and so on. But
it doesn't. Didn't believe in the original sin.
well, yeah, send me something on that. I'd like to see that. So anyway, it's risky for people to self-identify because oftentimes they don't really clearly understand what we're talking about. And approximately what percent of Americans don't know and couldn't care less? Well, that's probably a pretty healthy percent. 40, 50, maybe, something like that. All right, so what are the options that we're faced with? And one is to be actively engaged in the fight, okay, for decency, morality, and so on, as we're talking primarily about the state of our culture. So to be actively engaged in the fight, and there's plenty of avenues, by which we can get actively involved, including politics, of course. Or you can actively support those who are engaged in the fight. There are all these wonderful organizations, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and so many that we could probably name. Or how about this? Let's don't get involved in all these messy, controversial issues. Let's just be culture war pacifists. Okay, let's just love other people. And by the way, how could you possibly love another person if you really couldn't care less what they believe or how they live their lives or anything like that. That's not love. That's just compliance, really. But so many Christians, I think, want to be nice. They define Christianity as being nice. But anybody who's ever raised a child knows that true love, requires at times tough love, very assertive love, and so on. It's not just compliance with everything your little daughter or son want to do. So think about it this way: never in human history have pacifists ever won a war. Uh, and oftentimes, the bottom line is they wind up supporting oftentimes the worst side in a war. So that's true of the culture war as well. And we need to be very, very aware of that. We're called to be proactive in the cause of what's right and true. Dan?
Often we find this on the so-called religious left, but I'm afraid it's a big factor in even Bible-believing Orthodox church as well. And that is people really don't even know what love is. So like,
Right.
if we saw a mom give her daughter a pet tiger, right? We might say, this woman clearly does not love her child, doesn't care, right? But she might be offended by that. She might say, well, how dare you say I don't love my daughter? I have the warmest feelings for my daughter. They're like, we're not talking about your warm feelings. We're talking about your actions on her behalf. And so Christian love, at least agape love, is other sorts of love that we know from the Greek, but agape love is basically taking an interest in the other's well-being and acting on their behalf.
Right.
And coming alongside them to help. The Holy Spirit comes along our side. And so the woman may have the warmest feelings for her daughter, but she's not loving her daughter by giving her a pet tiger.
Yeah, it's not just affirming all of their impulses, is it? All right, so here's some options. Actively engage the fight. Hopefully, we all want to do that to the best of our ability. Also, actively support those that are involved in the fight who are doing great work, or just try to escape, duck and cover and be a culture war pacifist. Or there is a fourth option, and that is support the other side. That's basically progressive Christianity. And, thank God the United Methodist Church has broken up. It's not unique in the sense that its, what would you say, administration was very corrupt and very unbiblical in its base, because frankly, all the major mainline Protestant denominations, that's the case. That would be the case with the Presbyterian Church of the USA. Now, there are conservative Presbyterian denominations, but we're talking about the mainline Presbyterian Church. What's the symbol in the middle there? Looks like kind of communistic, doesn't it? But here you got somebody, maybe he could even be a pope holding a cross. What might that be symbolizing? Well, it's basically what we talk about liberation theology. And it's this futile attempt to try and mix Marxism and Christianity. And by the way, the current pope has been associated with that throughout much of his career. Or how about the Disciples of Christ denomination, one of the absolute most liberal Protestant denominations going back more than 100 years ago? What about the United Church of Christ? Now, this is not to be confused with the churches of Christ that we see, here in the South and Midwest and all. The UCC, United Church of Christ, to give you an example of how ultra liberal it was, it endorsed gay marriage back in the 1970s, long before even the Episcopal Church did, and long before a lot of the other liberal denominations did as well. By the way, the UCC, that was the church there in South Chicago that Barack and Michelle Obama were involved in. What was that pastor's name?
Jeremiah Wright.
Yeah, Jeremiah Wright. Yeah, yeah. All right, so what's the solution? Well, Schaeffer would argue it's not evangelism alone. Now, again, sharing the gospel is our priority, and that's what's most important. But what's most important doesn't mean it's the only thing important. So not just evangelism, but holistic discipleship, which, by the way, would incorporate evangelism. Schaeffer puts it this way: the Lordship of Jesus Christ in the whole of life. He uses that term in a lot of his writings. Holistic discipleship is basically a biblically based assessment of philosophy, our philosophy of life. Everybody has a philosophy of life, whether it's well defined and well thought through or not. It also determines our theology, our understanding of history, economics, the proper role of government, how do we view culture and the arts, and so on. So it's a holistic assessment. And here you see some of the many options out there, from humanism to Buddhism to the worship of money. And so a comprehensive Christian worldview, Bible-centered understanding of the whole realm of reality. So the solution, as Greg Jasson, I quoted him earlier, writes, what Schaeffer, along with the more scholarly C.S. Lewis, provided in the turbulent last half of the 20th century was the confidence that historic Christianity could compellingly contend in the circle of ideas at any level and fear no issue. So in other words, if we understand our faith as we should, there is no reason to back down in the midst of any challenge to our faith. And again, that takes us into the realm of Christian apologetics. And there's only one reason to be a Christian, if that is if Christianity is in fact true. But we have to understand, how to explain and defend it, and defend the truth of the Christian faith, and do it in love. Okay. Schaeffer, like C.S. Lewis, really focused on the rarest of all the virtues. And, there are many virtues we could name, but the most rare would be what? Courage. Think about it. Courage. The most. And just to punctuate what I just said, the music just came on somewhere in the building here. So the most rare virtue is courage. Wow. We need to take that very, very seriously, don't we? So here's a warning. Contemporary Christianity lacks wise and courageous prophetic voices amidst all the spiritual, all the moral and cultural chaos of our time. We'll be talking about Francis Schaeffer next week as well. Then we'll go on into Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, and then we'll finish our course with Eric Metaxas's letter to the American Church. So, very, very valuable resources. And I think the deeper we get into books like that, the more meaningful and applicable they become.
Jeffrey, there's a viewing or something of this movie.
Yes, where?
Well, I got some information from one of the subscribers to the Watchman, and I'll send that out.
Yeah, please do, because Corley and Ron and I were talking about that. We'd like to preview it here or somewhere. And by the way, I got some information I wanted to share with you on how we might be able to do that. But yeah, if you would please let us know about that.
Subscribe and watch it, at home. Maybe for
Okay, so now it's available to watch. Now it's available to watch on. at home, and it's a Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas, which I think is about an hour-long video, if I remember correctly. I've seen it and all. So while Dan's looking up that information, boy, please ponder this. Now, this is a British poster that was published during World War I. And you can imagine, here's a father, his two children, little girl sitting on his lap. And it occurs to her to ask her father, oh, by the way, what did you do in the Great War, Daddy? Now, you can see the pensive look on his face. And how is he going to answer that? Maybe he was very involved. Maybe he ducked and covered and let the storm blow past him. So I think we could apply that brilliant poster, the theme of it, to our current culture war. What did you do in the great culture war that is just absolutely ravaging America, isn't it? So what are we doing? Be actively engaged. There are great organizations that we can support, or you can just, be on the sidelines there and refuse to commit.
The question would be, if God asked us, what did you do? You did.
Yeah, which would be a fit variation on that. Let me go back and see if we have any comments from the chat. Apparently not. We have just 3 or 4 minutes. Comments, questions, anything that you'd like to add or subtract, multiply or divide? Yes, Corley.
Eric Metaxas says all the time that to say or do nothing is to be complicit in it. So if you are a pacifist, you may as well just be on the other side.
Mm-hmm. And throughout history, and of course, every war, culture war or actual physical war, has its own dynamics. Occasionally, they might be a somewhat just war, usually not at all. But throughout history, many Christians have been pacifists, and rightly so, because basically what you had was 2 predator nations or rulers, trying to dominate the other one, and it wasn't worthy of getting involved in. So some pacifism has been very thoughtful and courageous, actually. But we're talking about, a culture war such as we're experiencing here in America today, where it's obviously good and evil, right and wrong. And in that case, there's no excuse. Dan, yes.
You mentioned Metaxas, about not being a pacifist. Of course, Metaxas first became a household name in Christendom by his Bonhoeffer book. Of course, Bonhoeffer is attributed to Bonhoeffer is attributed the famous statement, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act."
Yeah, very true. Yes, please.
From the great mind of Rush. You choose not to decide, but still have made a choice.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, very well put, Chuck.
He wrote, after Rod Freer wrote the book on Benedict Option, he wrote Live Not by Lies, co-opted the title from Alexander's book.
Yeah.
Which, of the same name, which is readily available online. And I think that's really a very good point about just what one person has to do. If you go into a meeting and somebody comes in and demands that you refer to them by their pronoun, that's a lie. You just don't do it. And So you take the
Yeah.
opportunity to live not by those lies. If you choose to do that, you'll find yourself in a lot of hot water. Very often, that the DEI thing, the intersectionality, all of that kind of stuff. If you choose not to live by it, you don't have to worry about seeking out martyrdom. Martyrdom will find you.
And that's such an important point you bring up. And look, we're not living in the America of even 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Things have radically changed. And there are going to be increasingly occupations and professions that no committed Christian can go into because they are so perverted.
Well, you're assuming you will be allowed.
Well, if you compromise, was what I was thinking. If you compromise with all of this insidiousness going on, then yeah, you can manage to
I think
get
it's
by.
very possible that Christians will be excluded.
Mhm.
You are not considered the best any longer by virtue of your
You're not considered.
considered the best
Oh, mhm.
just by virtue of your worldview.
Yeah.
Therefore, we will hire Delta airline pilots on other bases. Other than that.
Well, we've never experienced anything like this before. And Rod Dreher, by the way, does talk. I can't remember if it was Benedict Option or Live Not by Lies, that there are going to be plenty of professions and occupations that are just closed to Christians who stand up for their true beliefs. So the world has changed. Yeah, one more comment and then we'll close things down.
Along the lines of what Chuck said, there's a movie called The Hidden Life, and it's by Terrence Malick's the director of it. But it's very good in the sense that it's about a German who refused to go to the war.
Oh, yeah, we saw that. Came out 5-6 years
A
ago.
lot like what Roger is saying.
Yeah.
Stand up. If you don't have to speak against it, just don't go along with it.
Right,
Still in
right.
trouble.
Right, yeah, and if I remember correctly, he was executed. Yeah, yeah. Oh my, so I know a lot of this could be troubling and hopefully it's not totally depressing. But look, most Christians throughout most of history of the last 2,000 years have had to sacrifice in one way or another in order to follow Christ. And why do we think that we deserve to get, why do we deserve an exception to that? So we're just very, very blessed. We're the most privileged and also, by the way, the most prosperous Christians in all of history. It won't necessarily always be that way, but regardless, we understand who our true Lord and Master must be, and we need to live our lives accordingly.
It seems that more and more of the mainline churches, how can you call them Christian?
Yeah, well, so-called progressive Christianity is not true Christianity. In fact, it's a different religion. But again,
Lisa Childers has a great thing on progressive Christianity this week. I'm going to try to put that on the Watchman.
okay.
She's interviewing someone, and what's the difference? And the statement was made, they still call themselves Christian.
Yes.
Because they feel like they're evolving to the true Christianity. So they still want to call themselves Christian, although they do not hold to the
That's right.
doctrine.
And if you go to their churches, they'll sing some of the same hymns that evangelical churches do, and they might even recite the Apostles' Creed and that sort of thing. But so much of what's preached refutes those earlier, doctrines that you get through those hymns and creeds and so on. So, well,
it speaks to that. And what the difference is.
well, thank you, and good being with you all as always. And those of you joining us online, it's really wonderful to have you all join us as well. Send me any comments or questions that you might have, any follow-up thoughts you might have. And we'll look forward to continuing next week. And hopefully we can finish the major points of the book on Francis Schaeffer next week. And then we can move on to Rod Dreher and the Benedict option. So blessings on your week.
Thank you.
And
Yours too.
good being with you.